Annie Kennedy is a dear friend, and I've known her for 20 years. Everyone's doing the math on my age, I know. But she's a leader in rare disease. And many don't know that she spent her younger years at MDA camp and then in leadership. And she's been serving the rare disease community for many, many years. And we are delighted to have her here to talk about her story and her leadership at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. And it's my honor to invite her to the stage to give the keynote address for this morning. Annie Kennedy.
I feel like we should have walk-up music in those transitions. Good morning, everybody. It's really an honor to be here, and it's been an honor to work with the Angelman community. Most recently, as Ryan's made his transition, but I've been in awe of the community for quite some time as I've been watching what you've been doing. As Allison was talking about this presentation, she was asking that I reflect a little bit on the impact that Angelman's been making. I've entitled the presentation, if the slides come up, Stronger Together, because that's really the approach of the Every Life Foundation, is that individual organizations need to take deep dives to move the needle for our respective organizations, but we come together through the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases to think about how we can collectively be learning from one another and how really together rare is not rare. You know, we can lift up our collective voices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that approach looks like. But as Ryan mentioned, I've been with the Every Life Foundation for just over 4 years, and prior to being with Every Life, I had spent about 25 years in rare disease with disease-specific organizations. So I have a deep appreciation for the individual approach and how we need to individually be moving the needle, but how we do need to also be able to come together and serve as force multipliers for one another. So I'm really honored to be here with you. So our US healthcare system, and this is not a surprise to anybody in this room, is really struggling with how to incentivize development. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, measure meaningful change, and assess value in all healthcare, but especially in rare disease. And we are uniquely positioned as the rare disease community to help inform that decision-making across the ecosystem. In the last 40 years, we've had really extraordinary signs of progress. And here are just a few in the last year. We've had communities that have had really milestone achievements, and I just put a few up here on the slide. Some communities who had their first approvals, and those approvals came through innovative approaches to rare disease therapeutic development and regulatory decision-making. And what was notable about those is that those approvals would not have been possible if those communities had not developed the endpoints themselves, funded the animal models and the natural history studies, and very importantly, helped fuel that regulatory infrastructure that informed that decision-making. But we also have real reason for concern as a community right now. We came into this year thinking we would be celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act, and we certainly are. This is a really banner year in that the Orphan Drug Act incentivized therapeutic development and brought companies to the space in a way that we'd never had before. But instead of just celebrating the Orphan Drug Act, we find ourselves fighting back the erosion of incentives for therapeutic development in rare. Instead of spending a lot of time this year looking for how we can expand those incentives and welcome more companies to our space, we find ourselves figuring out how we can work to protect those incentives. We're putting our energy into the wrong place. And what we know, what every person in this room knows, what I know because I entered the space because I had a loved one who lost his life very rapidly to a rare disease, is that time is our most precious commodity. We do not have time to waste. So here's the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach and why we are so grateful to work with FAST. We are a rare disease organization that brings together a coalition of partners that includes patient advocacy organizations, biopharmaceutical partners, and other coalitions. We were actually established initially by Dr. Emil Kakis, who we know is a beloved friend of the Angelman community. And we have two arms. We have our policy arm and we have our advocacy arm. Our policy arm we refer to as our community congress. That is informs all of our policy, and that is our coalition of partners. FAST is a member of our community congress. And we have our advocacy arm that we refer to as rare disease legislative advocates. And I'm going to talk about both. FAST has also been a leader within our advocacy efforts. How many people here participated in Rare Across America this summer? I know that FAST was really super engaged in that. Thank you. That is a part of our advocacy arm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do with respect to each of those. So here's a little glimpse at some of the ways that FAST has been engaged. So on the left, you can see some of the images from Rare Across America and some of the meetings that members of the Angelman community participated in. We convene Rare Disease Week on Capitol Hill every year during Rare Disease Day. This year it'll be that overlap between the end of February, beginning of March. Rare Across America is during those in-district days when your members of Congress go home to their home districts, and we facilitate meetings back in your congressional district in August. And then we also convene, we work with Congress. We've helped to establish the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus, and we hold congressional caucus briefings with the caucus throughout the year. And we've had a number of briefings this year, and we've been really delighted to have experts from your community testify at those caucus briefings. And David Gersick was one of the experts who testified at one of our congressional caucus briefings that drew a lot of attention this year, and his testimony really helped move the needle in Congress. So we're really grateful to your community. So just to talk a little bit about our policy priorities that we're really grateful to work with you on. And these policy priorities are shaped by our community partners. So having FAST at the table to help inform what it is that not just EveryLife work on, but that the broad rare disease community work on, that the 30 million Americans living with rare diseases voice to Congress work on is incredibly important. So our policy pillars are the elimination of the diagnostic odyssey in rare, expediting therapeutic development for those living with rare diseases, and informing access and value decisions, and doing that in a way that is anticipatory, not waiting until we have a regulatory decision. And this is another way I'd really like to give FAST a shout out. We have many members of this community that have been engaging with Medicaid and commercial payers in a very anticipatory way, getting ready for Angelman therapies. And actually, there's a very large meeting that many Medicaid directors have every year, and FAST was one of the most present visible communities that was at that meeting this year, with videos, with one-pagers, with information, not just about Angelman, but about what the considerations that payers would need to understand once there were approved therapies. I don't know of another community that has worked so proactively in the payer space. So that is really tremendous that you guys are so forward-leaning and so engaged already in that space. So here's just a little bit about rare, and this is our lived experience, but this is some data, and this is data that has been generated, again, by EveryLife in collaboration with those who are part of our community congress and our policy work. We know that there are more than 10,000 rare diseases and a conservative estimate of more than 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. Again, this is why it's so important that while we're working on our individual disease spaces, that we're coming together to work together to ensure that Congress understands that rare disease is a public health priority. That while they certainly need to be concerned with cancer, and we certainly need to be concerned with diabetes and many other chronic health conditions, that rare disease collectively is a public health priority, and that the funding currently going into rare disease is budget dust. And that what we need to be doing as a collective rare disease community, and why we come together under the umbrella of EveryLife, is to ensure that we can raise those budget lines, those funding lines. We can raise the rare disease umbrella priority. Then scientific investigators, organizations represented in the Angelman space can then come in and apply for that funding for individual Angelman projects. But if we don't come together to raise the priority and raise the flag for rare, we will never have those funding streams and voices. Another thing that we did is we actually worked to move from those back of the envelope calculations. So everyone in this room knows that when you receive a diagnosis of Angelman, there are so many costs involved with living with Angelman that come out of your pocket. There are so many things that you need in order to support your family and support your child and your loved one that do not get reimbursed anywhere. But we never actually had real data around that. And instead, what we spend so much time talking about in Washington, which is where I live and where I work, are therapeutic costs, the direct costs, what shows up in your medical bills, the ER admissions. But we never had real data around what the lived experience of rare disease actually was. So what we did as a community is a few years ago, we set out across our community to create the National Economic Burden of Rare Disease Study. We worked with over 200 rare disease organizations to develop a survey, and we collected this data. And we collected the data that included that direct cost data. So we looked at Medicaid and Medicare and the commercial data. But very importantly, for the first time ever, we also looked at that data around what those out-of-pocket costs were. What are those costs that usually get left on the editing room floor when we talk about what it costs to live with a rare disease? And we weren't just talking about home modifications and medical equipment that doesn't get reimbursed and nutritional supplements that you're paying for out of pocket. We also looked at costs that are referred to as productivity losses. What happens when you can't work full-time anymore? What happens when your child is hospitalized or your routine medical visits require that you travel and you're now not employed at the level that you anticipated you would be? Those costs were calculated into this study as well. And so for the first time, we had real data to now start to shift the conversation around the economic impact of rare disease. Now, there were limitations to how we could do this data. One of the really big limitations is that of the 10,000 rare diseases that we are estimated to know of, only 500 of those diseases can be tracked in direct cost data and healthcare data, because only 500 of those, about 500 of those have what's called an ICD code, or a code that we could, a hashtag, if you will, that we can look for in data. So there was a limitation of this data. This is a super conservative estimate. We know that. We did that on purpose because we wanted this data to be bulletproof. But of these costs, in 2019, it is estimated that the economic impact of living with a rare disease in the US was close to $1 trillion. And what was so important about this is that we also found that of that, 60% of those costs were coming out of the pockets of family and society. So we were able to start to shift that conversation. But we wanted to go a little bit further. We knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. So of those, that 40%, we started to look at, well, what were those 40%? Well, the 40%, those cost drivers, were inpatient costs, outpatient costs, hospitalizations, ER visits, and very importantly, the diagnostic odyssey. So we actually just conducted another study looking at what was the diagnostic odyssey in rare disease, and were there costs in the diagnostic odyssey that could be eliminated? Could we use the scientific tools available to us to shorten or eliminate the diagnostic odyssey in many rare diseases? Not just because we all know it's the right thing to do, that we could get people to the appropriate care and treatment sooner and optimize healthcare outcomes, but because there are also wasted costs in this diagnostic odyssey. And we can take that data to policymakers to try and then argue for newborn screening, for new diagnostics to be available. And we've just published that data as well. But none of this would be possible if we weren't coming together as a community and working as a collective and leaning in, because none of us can do this work alone. So this has been incredibly important, and we're so grateful to FAST for being at the table for us. with us so that we can be doing this work. Another thing I just mentioned is that most communities don't have that hashtag, if you will. Your community does. We work really closely with Combined Brain, led by Terry Jo Bichelle. I just presented on the ICD code roadmap at the meeting that she led. But this was a resource that, again, we came together with the community because so many communities are doing the work. The rocks are in the backpacks of patient advocacy groups to put together this infrastructure, to build the tools in order to develop that. I know today you're spending time talking about research development. All of these tools have to be in place in that tool belt, if you will, in order to design clinical trials and build that therapeutic roadway. So we're putting together the roadmap so that organizations don't have to start at square one, that they understand how to do it, what the constructs are, and what's worked for those who've gone before them. So again, we came together with the community, we put together this roadmap, and we also put together, for example, whiteboard videos to explain to communities what an ICD code is, how it's used, how they could help fundraise to develop this work. Another thing that we've done, Ryan's going to talk a lot about patient-focused drug development, or sometimes it's referred to as patient-focused medicine development. That entire ecosystem, it's become a movement, exists because the patient communities came together and said, we shouldn't be afterthoughts. Patient experience, what patients think about therapies, shouldn't just happen after a therapy has been approved. Shouldn't just think about us when it's time for that regulatory review and approval. We have to be considered at the very beginning. And so legislatively, patient communities have come together and actually created statutory frameworks in law that now require that patients are at the table. They require FDA to include patient experience data. It's codified in law that it's now not just called patient experience, it's patient experience data. And it's actually outlined in law, and Ryan's gonna go through what that means and what that looks like and what's included in that be included. And that drug developers, therapeutic developers, are including us at certain inflection points. And that has really flipped the script on how therapies are being developed. And FDA has put out a series of guidances, and a guidance that FDA shares what FDA's current thinking is about a concept. And FDA has put out a series of guidances about how patient experience data should be integrated into different elements of therapeutic development. So what we did at the Every Life Foundation is, as these guidances were coming out, the issue was the guidances were not being developed specific to rare disease therapy development, they were just being developed broadly. And we had a number of our sponsors, our biopharmaceutical sponsors, that were asking, this is all great, but there are two issues with it. The first is we don't know how it relates just to rare. And the second is we don't know whether these are conceptual, whether this is FDA saying this is just a good idea, or whether this has actually happened yet. And when you're a sponsor, one of the things that's really difficult is unpredictability. That if FDA just says, this would be a good idea, but there's no case study, there's no example to point to. So what we did is we worked with the sponsors that we work with across the space, and there are hundreds of them in rare. But most importantly, we also worked with patient advocacy groups who we work with, who are working in the therapeutic development space. And we designed a series of roundtables, and we pulled in all of the guidances across FDA that were looking at how patient experience data was being considered, but we also looked at how the patient-focused drug development ecosystem was moving. And so many of our communities have had externally led patient-focused drug development workshops. So many of our communities are moving through the space and are having successes and sometimes not such positive experiences in therapeutic development. And we were able to do an assessment of that, publish all of those workshops, but then very importantly, put out this guide to patient involvement in rare disease therapeutic development so that we could, again, make sure that everybody was learning from each other's experiences. At several points during this series, we met with FDA and we pulled in FDA's feedback and we shared with them what we were hearing and what we were learning and observing. And then most importantly, in this guide, we linked to every single resource that we were talking about and referring to, and all of the case studies. So it's all pulled together and readily available for you or for anybody that is interested in learning from this. So again, what we can do when we work together. One other thing I'll just refer to is that we are, again, very active on Capitol Hill, but we also know you're very active on Capitol Hill, and it is impossible for each organization to be tracking each and everything that's happening on Capitol Hill. So what we do as a collective coming together is we have a policy working group and a regulatory working group that come together and are constantly assessing the legislative items that are moving on the Hill through the lens of rare disease. And so this is just an example of our legislative policy grid and how we prioritize the issues that, as a collective, the community comes together and says, we think every life, this is such a priority and there's nobody else leading in this space, every life should be leading. Or this is something that has leadership, we should be supporting it and leaning into it as a community, but somebody else is leading it. Or this is something that should be engaged, but we don't need to be leading as much into. But it gives us a sense of how much bandwidth we should be putting into it, how much time and effort, and how much information our community partners want to be receiving about it. And then monitoring our issues that our partners have flagged as important, that we can continue to put out information about, but maybe haven't been introduced in both chambers of Congress, are still moving or need more refinement, and we can be flagging. And we have a portal that's for our partners only that we can continue to put out changes. Also, whenever there are opportunities to submit comments and Federal Register notices, we will work on drafts together as a community Congress. But again, we try and take the rocks out of the backpacks of individual organizations. All right, we spend a lot of time working on policy opportunities to de-risk therapeutic development. I started with, we are really concerned about expanding, protecting, and enhancing regulatory incentives. I was looking at the sponsors for this conference and was thrilled to see how many sponsors in the biopharmaceutical space you have here. Years ago, there wouldn't have been any at a meeting for Angelman. I just came from a meeting Thursday and Friday for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We have a consortium of partners in Duchenne that has more than 48 companies in that space. When I and Ryan first started working in Duchenne many years ago, we didn't have anybody in the Duchenne space. The problem is, with the incentives that are beginning to shift, we worry that we're making it harder for companies to work in our space, not more attractive. And we have to work with great urgency to ensure that companies can continue to and are more incentivized to work in the rare disease space. And there are a number of bills or incentives that will be expiring in the next few years that we need to protect and think about enhancing, actually, in rare, because we have such robust pipelines. This is such an important place and space for our communities. We need more, not less. So this is just a list of some of the things that we are thinking about. This is, I will share the slides because I want to move a little quickly through this section. But these are some of the flexibilities that FDA has. We're concerned with how FDA utilizes them and the consistency with which they may or may not be using them. We've seen some communities have great success and see therapies be approved, where we see other communities that are not yet benefiting from these same flexibilities, and we are very concerned about that. The National Academies of Medicine and Sciences is actually right now doing a study and convened a workshop earlier this week looking at the flexibilities and authorities that FDA has versus the flexibilities and authorities that the EMA, which is the regulatory authority in Europe, has. I was really honored to have an opportunity to present at that workshop, and actually Terry Jo Bichelle is on the committee and one of the people that is going to be reporting back on that. And I am happy to share the slides from that. That presentation that we made to NASM was informed by our community Congress partners. So Every Life doesn't testify or make presentations without the input of our community Congress partners. Another really important reason for the community to be engaging together. This is just a list of some of the things that we have been bringing forward that we are really concerned about. And again, we will make this all available to you. But one of the things I'll flag is that we're just, again, really concerned about how patient community expertise and patient experience data, which is a movement that is growing, is being pulled throughout the drug development ecosystem. So how is this data actually really informing the development of outcome measures, new clinical programs, and regulatory decisions? And then how is it being used in the labeling and in the post-market setting? That's a really big issue now. I, again, just came from a meeting around gene and cell therapies. And with respect to some of the gene and cell therapies that are being approved, we're hearing a lot from providers that there's this gap where there's limited information available based on what gets submitted to FDA, but providers and patients have to make a lot of decisions, and there's a limited amount of data, and so there's a lot of guesswork based on what's actually safe, who are therapies really available for, and when there are multiple therapies approved in a space, how should these therapies be taken in combination? Should they be taken sequentially? What's really the safety and efficacy on these therapies being taken together? There is more that FDA could be doing and that we as patient communities could be doing. I would submit to you that we are collecting that data. We're just not pushing it and pulling it all the way through. And then I'm just going to flag for this last one, which members of our rare disease communities are being left behind. We have a lot of incentives and flexibilities that are not yet benefiting so many in our rare community. Accelerated approval is a pathway that I know this community talks a lot about and focuses on. The accelerated approval pathway is working in rare disease. We are seeing this pathway change lives and outcomes for individuals with rare disease. One of the things we've been really concerned about at EveryLife is that as legislative decisions are made and conversations are had in Washington, we still lump what we've learned about the accelerated approval pathway in one big bucket. So we talk about oncology and infectious disease and rare disease and more common diseases all together. And so we've been generating data that looks at what's happening in rare disease separately from these other disease categories. So this is a study that we've been doing. We were really grateful to have a lot of really wonderful leaders in the rare disease community help advise on this study. But this is an assessment of what we've been seeing related to orphan drug approvals by disease area through FDA. And what you can see is just in the orphan space, as FDA has been making decisions, we've seen a big bump in those oncology approvals. And then this is how FDA's divisions are divided. So I want to flag that the Division of Rare Diseases and Medical Genetics is not the only division looking at rare diseases. Rare diseases are in these other divisions also. Other divisions are not seeing the same rate of approvals evenly. And then the same thing is happening for new molecular entities. And so what's telling to us about this is that we have a reason to be concerned about the unevenness of the application of flexibility and predictability. So I'm just going to keep moving. One of the things we've been pushing for is we want to centralize those expertise at FDA. We want rare disease experts to be sharing their learnings. We know that some products have to switch divisions multiple times in the cycle of a product approval. We think there are opportunities for additional efficiencies. One of these approaches was the community pushing for a center of excellence. I think it's fair to say FDA hasn't wrapped their arms around that concept, but we are still working towards some of the elements of that concept for the benefit of the rare disease community. One of the other communities that we know has been left behind are our smaller rare populations, which are often referred to as the ultra-rare population. We don't have a statutory definition for ultra-rare in the US, but there are many different cutoffs and definitions that are commonly used, some outside the US, and even there are some authorities in the US that have their own definitions. That causes a lot of confusion. And regardless of where you define it or where you create a cut hold, we know that there has been uneven momentum for rare diseases, for ultra-rare diseases or the smaller populations. We also know that of all of the rare diseases, only 37 rare diseases are on the federal newborn screening panel. That's a small fraction of 1%. This is just a back of the envelope calculation of what we know about approvals for non-oncologic orphan diseases. If we sort of cut it down and look at fewer than 1,000, fewer than 500, fewer than 5,000, showing that we need more incentives for our smaller populations. So one of our approaches has been that for those of you that went to Rare Disease Week last year, we've been asking for an appropriation for the National Academies to do a study and look at the opportunities for incentivizing research in this population and their smaller rare diseases, and what an appropriate scientific threshold might be and what those additional incentives could be. We're convening a scientific workshop in May to explore this further. And then the last thing I'll say, because your community's been super engaged in this, is that while I spent the most of the time here talking about policy to align with the themes of today's meeting, we spend a lot of time creating tools and resources for our advocates and for our community to be able to raise their voices and individual priorities to members of Congress. Your community has been super engaged in this, and we're grateful for that, but we invite you to Rare Disease Week this year. We encourage you to continue to engage in Rare Across America. For those that are interested in ramping up your engagement and your advocacy, we offer courses called Rare Advocacy Learning, and for young adults, our YAR program has a drug development workshop, and then we offer grants and stipends through our Rare Giving program. And then always our newsletters and monthly webinars are working to break down what's happening on the Hill in real time. I mentioned our Congressional Rare Disease Caucus. These are the leaders of the caucus. Please go to our website to see whether or not your representatives are part of the caucus, and if they're not, we have tools and resources to help you get them there. And I would just end with this message. Our pipelines are promising and they're robust, but we must ensure that we don't just protect, but we enhance the incentives to transform this hope into reality. So thank you for having me, and thank you for all you do, and we're just really grateful to be partners with FAST.